explain how I measure a correct policy vote in a minute, but I've identified a few mechanisms to an incorrect policy vote that have to do with the number of candidates with the size of the choice set. And so the first is that as the number of candidates increases, the information costs for voters increase. So as the number of candidates increase, the amount of information in an election increases, and it becomes more costly to acquire. So one potential path to an incorrect vote is that voters don't acquire sufficient information about candidates. So as the number of candidates increases, they stop bothering to acquire information about candidates' policy positions, and so they make policy mistakes. They don't vote correctly with respect to policy because they don't have the information. A second possibility is that voters may actually choose to acquire information about candidates, but might have difficulty processing that information. So again, this is abundance of information, and it becomes difficult to make comparisons and weight and decide which candidate is a better fit for you as the number of candidates increases. So that could be another, that processing error could be another second potential path to an incorrect vote. The third possibility is that voters may choose to acquire the wrong information about candidates, and that may lead to an incorrect vote. So for example, perhaps as the number of candidates increases, voters, instead of acquiring information about policy, acquire information about candidates' biographies, personal histories, families. And to the extent that those aren't a good signal, if they're not a good signal of candidates' policy positions, that would be another path to an incorrect policy vote. An additional possibility is that voters may rely on candidates' appearances, their races, their genders, increasingly as the number of candidates increases. So last year, as part of this same survey, we looked at how voters' preferences for candidates varied with the number of candidates and the race of the candidates. And we found that for most voters didn't pay much attention to candidate race, or didn't vote for candidates based on their race, with smaller number of candidates. But as the number of candidates increased, voters became more likely to rely on race and vote for candidates of the same race. And so it's possible again that voters may start to rely more on candidate appearance as there are more candidates, and that this may lead into an incorrect vote. Again, so long as appearance is not a good signal of policy position. Now, if appearance was a very strong signal, then that might be fine. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be like a shortcut as the political cue you mentioned before for choosing among candidates? So I would vote for a woman because that would give me a cue that she's going to protect women's rights or whatnot.
Exactly, right. So the voters may be relying more on these kind of cues as the number of candidates increases. And the extent to which they'll be led to vote correctly with respect to policy, if they rely on those cues, is a function of how strong a signal the cue is of policy position. So if in fact women's issues are extremely important to you, and that woman is going to represent women's issues well, then voting for her based on her gender might be an effective strategy. If that's not the case, then it could easily lead you to voting incorrectly. And then a final possibility is that voters may rely on ballot order when evaluating and selecting candidates, and this may also vary with the number of candidates. So, and that this might lead into an incorrect vote as well. So voters might favor candidates with particular ballot positions, and again, this is all about the strength of the reliability of the signal. So if high-quality candidates are in favorable ballot positions, that might be an effective strategy. But if they're not, that might also lead voters to errors. And I expect all of these strategies to vary with the number of candidates.
Well, this electronic vote, how do you have this ballot position?
Right, so here in Brazil, that's not
Maybe the
ballot
number,
orders
like 1111 or 2222, the parties will give these numbers to
exactly, right.
stronger candidates.
Exactly, so this is that would be a similar kind of application here in Brazil. And I think it's very likely that here in Brazil, the strongest candidates, or at least the strongest candidates within the party, get the most favorable numbers, and so maybe it's actually not a bad signal of candidate quality or candidate connections. It may not be the worst signal, in fact. Right, because you can't disentangle the two, right? If anybody knows someone in the party who would like to randomize party numbers, I would be happy to do all of the work for you. Just give me their phone number or email. Would love to do that work.
Do you believe in Santa Claus?
I'm Jewish, I don't believe in Santa Claus. So, for this project, I've developed a new measure of correct voting. And as I mentioned, this measure of correct voting only measures correct policy voting. It doesn't make any judgments about voters who vote for candidates for other reasons. It's exclusively focused on policy. And the reason that is one, that allows me to develop a measure that I think is completely objective. And the second is that better diversity, better representation in policy positions is kind of the main benefit of providing voters with more choice. We want to see a more diverse set, more representative set of policies. Ultimately, that's what we care about, and that would be the reason why we provide voters with more choice. So as I've said, I think that this measure is completely objective. I'll show it to you. We'll see if you agree with me. It's based only on respondents' self-reported policy preferences. There's no weighting, no scaling. They don't have to place themselves on an ideological spectrum or explain their preferences for redistribution or taxation or anything like that. And so I think that the task I'll show you is difficult, but is easier than other tasks and does reduce the burden on respondents taking the survey. In order to make this possible, all candidates in the survey are going to take valence positions on issues. So rather than advocating for particular policies, they can advocate for policy outcomes. So they can advocate for things like less corruption, better schools, less crime, more jobs, etc. The kind of things that people who report being interested in a particular issue will all be in favor of. So anyone who tells you that corruption is the most important issue to them when voting for a candidate is clearly interested in less corruption, not more. And so those are the kinds of positions that the candidates can adopt. And then a final innovation is that what this measure does is it sets a baseline of for a probability of correct voting at 33%. So imagine if we have if there's only one candidate who's a correct vote for voters. When there's three candidates, there's a 33% chance of voters voting correctly if they kind of vote randomly or without thinking about policy positions. As the number of candidates increases, that probability is going to decrease. And so without this innovation, we'd kind of be would be stacking the deck against respondents seeing more candidates. And so what this does is that if people, the results won't be biased against people who saw 12 candidates. So if someone who sees 12 candidates votes randomly or without paying attention to all policy positions, they have the same chance of voting correctly as someone who saw 3 candidates. So whatever results we see will be a function of their kind of the strategies that voters adopt and not a function of the way the experiments are constructed. So we don't want 1 in 12 candidates being the correct vote with 12 candidates because it would be quite difficult. So instead it's equally difficult across conditions.
So just clarification question. So each candidate will take his balance position on a given issue. Is that correct?
Right, on 3 issues.
3 issues.
Yeah, I'm going to show you in a second. Well, here it is. So here's an example with 2 candidates. So we have candidate 1 and candidate 2. So respondents, the second step in the survey asks respondents to rank 12 policy issues in order of importance to them. So the question says something like, which of these issues is most important, or rank these issues to you in order of importance when voting for a candidate for Congress. And they're asked to rank them. So candidate 1 adopts or represents the respondent's first, second, and 11th most important issues as a function of that ranking. Candidate 2 represents the respondent's first, third, and 11th most important issues. So as we can see here, as the voter compares the 2 candidates, candidate 1 strictly dominates candidate 2. Right? The only difference between these 2 candidates is that candidate 1 presents the second most important policy position, candidate 2 presents the third most important policy position. And this is just based on what the respondent reported 1 minute ago as being the second most and third most important policy position. So I think that in this case we can objectively say that at least with respect to policy, with policy voting, candidate 1 strictly dominates candidate 2.
Weekly dominate.
Weekly.
Right? Weekly dominate because just one, it's better just to know one.
Right, so this is right. That's right.
So it would be important for voters to take into consideration the fact that some of those issues are not. So if you are elected for Deputy Federal, there's no way that you could affect crime in São Paulo. Suppose that you could not affect crime in São Paulo.
Right.
Right? Would that be important for the voters taking that into consideration, or?
That's a good question. So kind of in addition to what's important, what's realistic, what could be done, something like that.
Releasing in the sense that it's not, that's more of a state policy than federal policy, so there's not much that the top federal could do that better.
That's an interesting question. I mean, so the question asks them, what's most important to you in voting for a federal deputy? And then they're presented with candidates for federal deputy. So if they say crime is really important to them when voting for a federal deputy, this person represents crime, then we're going to say that, kind of that's a good fit. It's possible that, I guess I mean that that question comes into the ranking in the step before, right? Kind of the idea of what's realistic or not. They may say, boy, I wish someone would reduce crime, but for me what's important when voting for a deputy is education. education because they can't affect crime or something like that.
But do they know that? I mean, the average voter knows about this, that federal representatives are
Can do.
unable to change.
I'm not sure. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure, I think it's an interesting question, I'm not sure, I don't think that it biases the results because they're being asked, what do you vote based on? And then they're asked to vote. And so I think they're taking that into account the step before. But they probably don't know, I think.
I'm arguing in your favor because
Right.
it's kind of making a huge demand on voters that they know exactly who's responsible for what. I mean, federal representatives can do anything on crime, but they can go on education, on health, and other,
Right.
positions. I think if you are thinking about maybe the average voter is not able, maybe we are.
I don't think I'm capable of doing that very well. I mean, the first to admit
That's
that.
what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's demanding to expect that.
Yeah.
So, I think this task is not too difficult. We're just asking what matters to you and then see how, if they're able to pick out what matters to them, which is what they reported, but.
I don't know for Brazil, for example, I've seen for the US, a survey where they ask voters about if they could tell exactly which, if some policies were, if the state was responsible for that, if it was the federal government, and apparently they were able on average to allocate each policy to the right.
That's very surprising and interesting.
Yeah.
If I can add something,
They would
it would also be a very strict view of representation if you only vote.
Levels of federation.
Sorry. If they, even if the federal deputy doesn't have authority to decide on crime, he can also act in other ways in order to pressure governors to act on crime. So even if they don't have the sphere of authority to do that, they're still political actors that can indirectly influence your policy, the policy of your choice.
Right,
So-
they could appear on TV making speeches, they could
Yeah.
the government.
They campaign on crime.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. I haven't thought too much about that.
Reducing crime or?
No, reducing crime of what? Muçulmano, one example of this.
Wants to reduce crime.
Muçulmano was one of the most important points of his platform as federal representative campaign was against crime, reducing crime.
Even though we think it's not so.
Be more tough,
Typical.
criminal, all these stuff.
Okay, so this is the setup with two candidates. So and this is kind of some math just to show the logic, but I think we're all kind of clear on what the logic is. So, well, there's a couple of assumptions here, so I'll mention what they are. So the idea here is that the voter evaluates the utility they get from voting for candidate 1 or candidate 2, and they calculate that utility just by summing up the utility they get from each of the particular policy issues. So an assumption here in this second line is that these utilities are independent of one another, right? And so particular combinations of policy positions don't provide any extra benefit. And I think that's a somewhat controversial assumption. I think it's less controversial in this case because they're valence issues. So I think that certain policies might be really pretty contradictory, but I think policy outcomes might be less so. So I think that helps a bit. I think it's certainly a little controversial, but I think it works a little better in this context of valence issues. And so as we saw earlier, the voter, when comparing the two candidates, can kind of use some iterated domination to iterated deletion rather, to eliminate the issues that both candidates share and just compare the issues that are left, which is issue 2 and 3, and see in that case that candidate 1